The lights inside the cantina flickered in patterns that hurt human eyes but seemed normal to most other species. Captain Zixthar sat at a corner table with his squad, celebrating another successful contract. They had just finished escorting a merchant convoy through pirate territory, and the payment was good. The Vren captain raised his glass to his team, and they responded with cheers in a dozen different languages. Zixthar had been leading mercenary squads for 40 years. His dark blue skin showed scars from countless battles, and his 3 eyes could assess a threat faster than most species could draw their weapons. He trusted his instincts, and they had kept him alive when smarter mercenaries had died. Tonight those instincts were quiet as he enjoyed the rare peace that came between jobs. A Keltharian walked through the crowd toward their table. The species was known across the galaxy for 2 things: being excellent traders and being extremely cheap when hiring help. Zixthar watched the well-dressed alien approach with mild curiosity. The Keltharian wore expensive clothing that marked him as a broker, someone who connected clients with mercenaries for a percentage of the contract price. The broker stopped at their table and waited for permission to speak. Zixthar gestured to an empty seat, and the Keltharian sat down quickly. His 4 hands moved nervously as he placed a data chip on the table between them. The captain looked at the chip, but did not pick it up yet. He had learned long ago that appearing too eager cost money in negotiations. The broker spoke in trade language that most species could understand. He said his clients needed a small military operation completed quickly and with total discretion. The target was a human outpost on a colony world called New Dakota. The outpost was lightly defended by approximately 20 Terran Marines spread across 2 squads. The broker emphasized that speed was essential and that the payment would reflect the urgency of the situation. Zixthar picked up the data chip and inserted it into his personal reader. Numbers appeared in holographic display above the table, and his eyes widened slightly. The payment was triple the standard rate for this type of operation. His second-in-command, Krell, a massive Draken warrior covered in scales that could stop most small arms fire, leaned over to see the display and grunted in surprise. The captain looked at the broker with suspicion. Keltharians did not pay triple rates for anything unless something was seriously wrong with the job. He had worked with their kind before, and they would negotiate over every single credit. Offering 3 times the normal payment without negotiation meant this contract had problems that were not immediately obvious. Zixthar activated the full mission briefing on the data chip. The holographic display showed detailed scans of the human outpost. It was a standard frontier installation with basic defensive walls, some automated turrets, and what looked like 2 small buildings for housing and operations. The defenses seemed adequate for dealing with local wildlife or small raider groups, but nothing that would stop a determined assault by professional mercenaries. The broker continued talking while Zixthar studied the data. He explained that his clients were involved in a territorial dispute with the human colony. The outpost sat on land that both sides claimed ownership of, and there was an arbitration hearing scheduled in 6 weeks. If the outpost was abandoned before the hearing, it would strengthen his client's legal position significantly. The humans had refused all offers to leave peacefully. Krell spoke up and asked why the payment was so unusually high. The Draken was direct by nature and had no patience for games. The broker's expression shifted slightly, and he looked uncomfortable for the first time since approaching their table. He admitted that 3 other mercenary companies had already turned down this exact contract over the past 2 weeks. Zixthar felt his instincts suddenly wake up and start screaming warnings. 3 companies had refused a job that paid triple rates. That was extremely unusual in the mercenary business, where most crews would take almost any contract if the price was right. He asked the broker directly why those companies had refused such generous payment. The Keltharian shifted in his seat, and his 4 hands moved in patterns that indicated stress among his species. He said that the previous mercenary groups had done research on human military capabilities and decided the risk was too high. The broker quickly added that his clients believed those mercenaries were simply scared of Earth's reputation and were making excuses to cover their cowardice. The captain looked at his squad around the table. Most of them were veterans who had survived decades of combat across multiple wars. Vorn, their tactical specialist, was already accessing his own data reader and searching for information. Tix, One of the younger Vren warriors laughed and said that humans were just another species, and their reputation was probably exaggerated by losers who failed their contracts. Zixthar held up one hand for silence. He told the broker that his squad would need time to consider the offer and do their own research. The Keltharian looked disappointed, but nodded and said they had 24 hours to decide. If Zixthar's squad refused, the broker would move on to other options. He stood up from the table, gave a formal bow, and disappeared back into the crowd of aliens that filled the cantina. Krell immediately started arguing they should take the contract. The payment was enough that every member of the squad could retire comfortably if they wanted. The mission parameters seemed straightforward. 40 mercenaries against 20 humans in a fixed defensive position. They would have numerical superiority and the element of surprise. The Draken said he had fought in worse situations for half the pay. Vorn looked up from his data reader with a troubled expression on his face. The tactical specialist said he was finding some very disturbing information about human combat performance in the Galactic military archives. Several other squad members gathered around to look at Vorn's display, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to concern. Zixthar finished his drink and stood up from the table. He told his squad they would spend the next 24 hours doing thorough research before making any decisions. Any mercenary who survived 40 years in this business did so by never rushing into situations without understanding all the risks. Something about this contract felt wrong, and his instincts had kept him alive this long by making him cautious when others were reckless. The squad left the cantina together and headed back to their ship docked at Korval Station. The massive space station served as a neutral meeting ground for mercenaries, traders, and various other groups who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal. Here they could access military databases, contact other mercenary companies, and gather intelligence without worrying about local laws or authorities. As they walked through the crowded corridors, Zixthar thought about the 3 companies who had refused this contract before him. Professional mercenaries did not turn down triple payment without very good reasons. Whatever those reasons were, he intended to find them before making his decision. The money was attractive, but no amount of credits was worth walking his squad into a death trap. The squad gathered in the briefing room of their ship an hour after leaving the cantina. Zixthar stood at the front while Vorn connected his data reader to the main display screen. The tactical specialist had already begun compiling information about human military operations, and what he found made him unusually quiet. Vorn was normally confident and spoke freely about tactical assessments, but now he seemed hesitant to share what he had discovered. The first file Vorn opened was labeled Battle of Broken Ridge, and the date showed it was only 3 years old. The report came from Craig Military Archives and had been declassified after their war with humanity ended. Zixthar read through the document while his squad watched the display. A single human squad of 12 soldiers had held a defensive position against an entire Craig regiment for 6 days straight. Krell interrupted and said that had to be an exaggeration or propaganda. No 12 soldiers from any species could hold against hundreds of attackers for that long. Vorn shook his head and brought up combat footage that the Crag had recorded during the battle. The video showed human soldiers moving between positions with efficiency that seemed impossible for beings who should have been exhausted after days of constant combat. The footage revealed humans setting traps using improvised explosives made from mining equipment they found at the site. They used local wildlife patterns to predict enemy movements and positioned their defenses accordingly. 3 of the 12 humans were wounded during the first day, but they continued fighting from stationary positions while their healthier squad members rotated through more active roles. By the time human reinforcements arrived on day 6, those 12 soldiers had killed or wounded over 300 Crag warriors. Zixthar asked Vorn to find more recent examples to verify this was not just one exceptional unit. The tactical specialist pulled up another file dated from 8 months ago. This report detailed the actions of a single human named Sergeant Jake Murphy during a battle on the frontier, world of Helios Prime. Murphy's entire squad had been killed when their position was overrun, but the sergeant refused to abandon the bunker he was defending. The after-action report from the attacking force described 11 hours of continuous combat. Murphy fought with his rifle until the weapon overheated and became completely unusable. He switched to his sidearm and continued firing until that ammunition was exhausted. Then he used grenades that he threw with remarkable accuracy despite being wounded twice. When his explosives ran out, Murphy engaged enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat using a combat knife, and even his bare hands when the knife broke. When friendly forces finally retook the position, they found Murphy unconscious from blood loss but still alive. Surrounding him were the bodies of 47 enemy soldiers that he had killed by himself. The human military gave him a medal and 3 months of medical recovery before sending him back to active duty. Vorn noted that the report was written by the enemy forces, not by humans trying to make themselves look good. Tick spoke up and said that individual heroics happened in every species, and this proved nothing about humans in general. Zixthar agreed that exceptional soldiers existed everywhere, but asked Vorn to search for information about typical human military performance, not just extraordinary examples. The tactical specialist nodded and opened a medical database that contained comparative physiology data on all known military species. The medical files on humans revealed information that disturbed everyone in the room. Human bodies produced natural combat stimulants through a hormone system they called adrenaline. When threatened or injured, human bodies would flood themselves with chemicals that increased strength, speed, and pain tolerance. The medical report noted that wounded humans often became more dangerous, rather than less dangerous, because their survival instincts would override rational thought and push them to fight even harder. Vorn found a report from a Zentari military doctor who had treated both human and non-human casualties during a joint operation. The doctor wrote that humans could continue fighting with injuries that would incapacitate most other species. He documented cases where humans fought effectively despite broken bones, severe burns, or blood loss that should have rendered them unconscious. The doctor concluded that human pain tolerance was abnormally high compared to other species and recommended that military forces never assume a wounded human was no longer a threat. Another file discussed human evolutionary history. Unlike most sentient species who evolved as prey animals or opportunistic omnivores, humans descended from persistence hunters. Their ancestors would chase prey animals for hours or even days until the target collapsed from exhaustion. This evolutionary background meant humans had unusual endurance and a psychological drive to never give up once they committed to a goal. The file suggested this made humans extremely dangerous in prolonged engagements where other species would withdraw or surrender. Krell watched the information scroll across the display, and his earlier confidence began to fade. He asked if there was any footage of actual combat between mercenaries and human forces. Vorn searched through several databases before finding a recording from the Tychon uprising 2 years ago. A human platoon had been ambushed and cut off from support by local militia forces, who had hired mercenary assistance. The video showed 30 human soldiers fighting against approximately 90 enemies with mercenary support. The humans did not panic when surrounded and instead formed a defensive circle that moved slowly toward better terrain. When one human's rifle was destroyed by enemy fire, the soldier picked up a piece of metal debris and used it as a club while moving to retrieve a fallen enemy's weapon. Another human who was badly wounded deliberately exposed himself to draw enemy fire toward his position and away from his healthier squad members. The engagement lasted 4 hours and ended when the attacking forces withdrew. The mercenaries had lost 20 soldiers and the militia lost 30 more. The human platoon reported 8 casualties with 2 killed. The mercenary commander's report stated that continuing the attack would have resulted in complete loss of his force and recommended that future contracts avoid engaging human military units whenever possible. Zixthar stopped the video and looked at his squad. He could see doubt on faces that had been confident just hours earlier. Vorn brought up one more document that he said was the most concerning piece of information he had found. It was an intercepted communication between 2 Zelnar military commanders discussing whether to hire human mercenaries for an upcoming operation. The first commander suggested that humans would be extremely effective soldiers for hire given their combat capabilities. The second commander refused absolutely and explained why. He said that human mercenaries had a reputation for being effective, but also troublesome. They asked too many questions about their contracts and had uncomfortable ethics. If humans discovered that their employer had lied to them, or if the contract involved targeting civilians, they had been known to turn on their employers with extreme violence. The Zelnar commander concluded by saying that hiring humans was like bringing a dangerous predator into your home. They would be loyal as long as they believed you were honest with them. But the moment they felt betrayed, they became your worst enemy instead of your ally. He recommended never hiring humans unless absolutely necessary, and never lying to them under any circumstances. Zixthar turned off the display and faced his squad. He told them they would continue researching tomorrow by talking to other mercenaries at the station, who might have direct experience with humans. Tonight they should all rest and think carefully about what they had learned. The captain made it clear that no decision would be made until they had gathered all available information. The money was attractive, but knowledge was more valuable than credits when survival was at stake. The next morning, Zixthar left his ship and walked through the busy corridors of Korval Station, looking for other mercenary companies. Word traveled fast in their business, and he knew that asking questions about the Keltharian contract would draw attention. That was exactly what he wanted, because attention meant other mercenaries would come forward with their own stories and information. He found the first group in a equipment supply shop where several Thraxian mercenaries were purchasing ammunition. The Thraxians were large reptilian beings known for their strength and direct approach to combat. Zixthar recognized their unit markings and knew they were veterans with at least 20 years of experience. He approached their leader and asked if they had ever taken contracts against human targets. The Thraxian commander looked at Zixthar with eyes that had seen too many battles. He said his company had made that mistake once and would never repeat it. The commander invited Zixthar to join them for a meal and said the story was worth telling, if only to save other mercenaries from the same costly lesson. They sat in a small restaurant that catered to carnivorous species, and the Thraxian began his tale. 5 years ago, his company had been hired to attack a human outpost at Epsilon Crossing. The outpost had been raided by pirates the week before, and the clients assured the Thraxians that the defenses were damaged and the garrison was weakened. The payment was good, and the intelligence suggested an easy victory. The Thraxian commander said they brought 60 soldiers against an estimated 15 humans. They had better weapons, better armor, and the advantage of surprise. The attack began at dawn and should have been finished within 2 hours. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that lasted all day and cost them 40 soldiers before they finally withdrew in defeat. The humans had used the week after the pirate raid to prepare for another attack. Every approach to the outpost was trapped with improvised explosives made from materials that would not show up on standard scanners. The Thraxians lost 8 soldiers to mines before they even saw the outpost walls. When they pushed forward, they discovered that every piece of ground was covered by overlapping fields of fire from multiple positions. The commander described how the humans had created a defensive system where each position supported the others. If his soldiers tried to flank one position, they would be caught in crossfire from 2 other positions. If they concentrated their forces to overwhelm one point, the humans would shift their defenders to reinforce that exact spot. It was like fighting an opponent who could read their intentions before they acted. What truly broke the Thraxian assault was not the defenses, but the humans themselves. The commander said that wounded humans did not retreat or call for medical assistance. They stayed in position and continued fighting as if nothing had happened. When one human position was finally overrun after intense combat, the Thraxian soldiers found that the 3 defenders had been wounded multiple times but had never stopped shooting until they were physically unable to continue. The Thraxians withdrew after losing 2/3 of their force. The human garrison reported 8 casualties, and none of them were fatal. The commander said his company spent months recovering from that single engagement, and the financial cost almost destroyed their business. He told Zixthar that no amount of money was worth fighting humans who defended their positions like every battle was personal. Zixthar thanked the Thraxian for his story and continued his search through the station. Word had spread that he was researching human military capabilities, and other mercenaries began approaching him with their own experiences. A Skrell hunter found him in one of the station's common areas and asked to speak privately. The Skrell were known as excellent trackers and hunters who often worked as scouts or assassins for mercenary companies. This particular hunter showed Zixthar scars across his chest and arms that had clearly come from close combat. He said his crew had taken a contract to raid a human medical station 3 years ago. They believed medical facilities would be lightly defended by non-combat personnel. The hunter explained that was their first and worst mistake. Human military doctrine treated medical personnel as soldiers first who happened to have medical training. The medics at the station fought with the same intensity and skill as any combat troops. They defended their patients with savage determination and fought in ways that shocked the Skrell team who expected an easy raid. The hunters said they lost half their crew and accomplished nothing. The human medics never panicked or tried to surrender. They set traps, used their medical knowledge to target vulnerable areas on Skrell anatomy, and coordinated their defense with frightening efficiency. His crew withdrew in chaos, and he swore never to take another contract involving humans in any capacity. As the day continued, more stories emerged from different mercenary groups. A Draken company commander spoke about a contract where they were hired to provide security against potential human raids. The humans never attacked, but the Draken forces spent 3 months in constant stress wondering when the assault would come. The psychological pressure of facing potential human opponents was so intense that several of his soldiers requested transfers to other units. An elderly Zentari broker pulled Zixthar aside and gave him what he called the economic reality of contracts involving humans. She explained that jobs targeting human military forces paid triple or quadruple normal rates, not because they were 3 times harder, but because they were 10 times more dangerous. The high payment was essentially danger money, and even then, most smart mercenaries refused these contracts entirely. The broker said she had been in the business for 50 years and had watched the patterns change. 20 years ago, mercenary companies would take contracts against any target if the price was right. Then humans began expanding into frontier space, and early conflicts taught mercenaries a hard lesson. Companies that fought humans suffered catastrophic casualties even when they won. Many went bankrupt from the cost of replacing lost soldiers and equipment. Over time, an informal rule emerged among experienced mercenaries that the broker called the Iron Rule. Never take contracts against human military targets unless you have overwhelming force and absolutely no other option. Even then, expect heavy casualties and seriously consider whether the payment is worth the cost. The broker said that mercenary companies who ignored this rule usually did not survive long enough to learn from their mistakes. Zixthar spent hours talking to different mercenaries, and every conversation reinforced the same message. Humans were extremely dangerous opponents who fought with an intensity that other species found difficult to match. Their pain tolerance, endurance, and psychological drive made them nightmare opponents in any direct combat situation. As evening approached, Zixthar returned to his ship where his squad was waiting for his report. Krell asked if he had learned anything useful, and the captain said he had learned everything he needed to know. The stories were consistent across multiple independent sources and came from mercenaries who had no reason to lie or exaggerate. These were professional soldiers admitting they had been beaten by opponents they had underestimated. Vorn had continued his own research during the day and found even more disturbing information. He discovered that human military training focused heavily on small unit tactics and individual initiative. Human soldiers were trained to continue fighting even when cut off from command or support. They were taught to improvise weapons and tactics using whatever resources were available. Most importantly, they were trained never to surrender as long as they could still fight. Zixthar called for a squad meeting to discuss everything they had learned. He knew the decision ahead would determine not just their financial future, but possibly their survival. The Keltharian contract was still open for a few more hours, and they needed to decide whether any amount of money was worth the risk they now understood they would be taking. The squad gathered in the briefing room once again, and Zixthar could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew that this decision would define their future in ways that went beyond simple financial gain or loss. Krell stood near the back with his arms crossed while Vorn sat at the front, with his data reader still displaying information about human combat capabilities. The younger members of the squad looked uncertain while the veterans wore expressions of careful consideration. Zixthar began by laying out everything they had learned over the past 24 hours. He displayed the files they had gathered, the combat footage they had reviewed, and summaries of the conversations he had with other mercenaries. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. Human soldiers were exceptionally dangerous opponents who fought with an intensity that most other species could not match or sustain. Krell spoke first and argued that they should still take the contract. He acknowledged that humans were tough opponents but pointed out that every species had warriors with impressive records. The Draken people had their own tales of impossible victories and legendary last stands. He said they were professional mercenaries with 40 soldiers against 20 humans. They had numerical superiority, better equipment, and the element of surprise. The payment was enough that every squad member could retire comfortably. The Drakon warrior said that fear was natural before any battle, but they could not let stories and rumors control their decisions. They had faced difficult opponents before and survived through skill and teamwork. He believed they were overthinking the situation and turning down guaranteed wealth because of exaggerated tales told by mercenaries who had failed their missions and needed excuses for their losses. Vorn disagreed strongly and brought up his tactical analysis on the main display. He had run computer simulations using all the data they had gathered about human defensive tactics and combat performance. The tactical specialist explained that even giving their squad every possible advantage, the computer models predicted a minimum 40% casualty rate. That meant they would lose at least 16 soldiers out of their 40-member force. The simulations assumed everything would go perfectly according to plan. If the humans had time to prepare defenses or if they turned out to be special forces rather than regular Marines, the casualty estimates jumped to 70% or higher. Vorn said that from a purely mathematical standpoint, the contract made no sense. They would spend more on medical care and replacing lost squad members than they would earn from the payment. Tick stood up and said they were all acting like frightened children scared of ghost stories. He was young for a Vren warrior at only 15 years of service, and had not yet learned the careful caution that kept older mercenaries alive. He argued that humans were just another species, and their reputation was probably built on propaganda and lucky circumstances. Every species wanted others to fear them, and humans were no different. Several other younger squad members voiced agreement with Tick's. They pointed out that their company had never failed a contract in its entire history. They had fought against larger forces, better equipped enemies, and in more difficult terrain. Refusing this contract would damage their reputation and make other potential clients think they were unreliable or cowardly. Zixthar let the debate continue for another hour, while he observed his squad carefully. He had learned long ago that good leaders listened to their soldiers before making final decisions. The arguments went back and forth with the younger members generally supporting acceptance of the contract, while the veterans leaned toward refusal. The squad was almost evenly divided, and he knew that whatever decision he made would disappoint half his soldiers. Finally, Zixthar held up his hand for silence, and everyone stopped talking immediately. He had commanded this squad for 20 years, and they trusted his judgment even when they disagreed with his conclusions. The captain stood and walked to the front of the room where everyone could see him clearly. He began by saying he had fought in over 200 engagements across 40 years of mercenary work. He had learned to distinguish between propaganda and truth, between fear and healthy respect. The captain explained that everything he had found about human combat capabilities pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The reports were not exaggerated. The evidence came from multiple independent sources, including humans' enemies, neutral observers, and even humans' own military records. The consistency across all these different sources was what convinced him the information was reliable. Zixthar pointed out that humans themselves did not brag about their achievements. Most of the impressive combat reports came from their opponents or from neutral military analysts. When humans wrote their own after-action reports, they used dry clinical language that understated what they had accomplished. This was the opposite of propaganda, where the creators would exaggerate and boast. He shared one final piece of information that he had not yet told the squad. Before the meeting, Zixthar had contacted a retired mercenary named Grix who had once worked alongside human soldiers as allies during the Fringe rebellions. Grix had 45 years of combat experience and was respected throughout the mercenary community for his wisdom and honesty. The old soldier's advice had been simple and direct. He said that humans were the best friends you could have in a fight and the worst enemies you could face. As allies, they would die to protect you and would never abandon you no matter how bad the situation became. As enemies, they would make you wish you had died quickly instead of facing them in prolonged combat. Grix had told Zixthar that fighting alongside humans had taught him more about warfare than his previous 30 years of experience. He also said that watching humans fight against common enemies had shown him capabilities that seemed impossible. The old mercenary strongly recommended avoiding any contracts that put you in opposition to human military forces, unless you had no other choice and were prepared to accept massive casualties. Zixthar looked at each member of his squad as he continued speaking. He explained his reasoning for rejecting the contract despite the enormous payment. First, the consistency of negative reports from credible sources. Second, the verified footage and documentation in the Galactic archives. Third, the fact that 3 other experienced mercenary companies had already refused this same contract. Fourth, the unusually high payment, which indicated the clients knew this was extremely dangerous. The captain said he valued every member of his squad and did not want to lead them into a battle where half of them would die or be crippled. No amount of money was worth that cost. They could find other contracts that paid well without requiring them to attack one of the most dangerous military forces in known space. He called for a vote and made it clear that he would follow the majority decision even if it went against his own recommendation. This was not a dictatorship, and every squad member had a voice in decisions that affected their lives. The voting took place by secure electronic ballot, so no one would feel pressured by seeing how others voted. The results appeared on the main display after everyone had submitted their choice. 15 squad members voted to reject the contract while 8 voted to accept it. Krell and most of the younger warriors had voted to take the job, but they were outnumbered by veterans who had learned to trust their instincts over their greed. Zixthar felt relief wash over him as he saw the results. His squad had made the smart choice and would live to fight another day. He told them all to get rest because tomorrow he would inform the Keltharian broker of their decision, and then they would begin searching for their next contract. This time they would look for jobs that paid well without requiring them to face the most dangerous soldiers in the galaxy. The next morning, Zixthar found the Keltharian broker in the same cantina where they had first met. The broker looked tired and frustrated, as if he had spent the past day trying to find mercenaries willing to take his contract. He saw Zixthar approaching and his expression became hopeful. For a moment, before recognizing the captain's body language and realizing the answer would be negative, Zixthar sat down across from the broker and returned the data chip containing the contract details. He explained that his squad had done extensive research and decided the risk was too high, regardless of the payment. The broker's hopeful expression collapsed into disappointment and then anger. He asked what it would take to change their minds and offered to increase the payment by another 50%. The captain shook his head and said that no amount of money would make the contract acceptable. He had talked to other mercenaries who had fought against humans, and the stories were consistent. Human soldiers were exceptionally dangerous opponents who inflicted catastrophic casualties even when they lost battles. Zixthar recommended that the Keltharians settle their territorial dispute through diplomatic channels instead of military action. The broker looked desperate now and admitted that they had already tried diplomacy without success. The human colony refused to abandon the outpost, and the arbitration hearing was only 5 weeks away. If the outpost remained occupied, the Keltharians would likely lose their legal claim to the territory. He said they had already approached 4 other mercenary companies and all had refused, just like Zixthar's squad. Zixthar thought for a moment and then mentioned the Krivor Reavers. They were a notorious mercenary company known throughout the galaxy for taking any contract regardless of how dangerous or ethically questionable it might be. The Reavers were expensive and brutal, but they never turned down work if the payment was sufficient. The broker's expression brightened immediately and he asked how to contact them. The captain provided the contact information and warned the broker that the Reavers would demand an enormous payment and would not care about minimizing casualties or collateral damage. The Keltharian said he would present the option to his clients and thanked Zixthar for the suggestion. He paid a small finder's fee for the referral and left the cantina quickly to make arrangements. 3 weeks passed and Zixthar's squad took 2 smaller contracts that paid decent rates without requiring them to face unusually dangerous opponents. They escorted another merchant convoy and provided security for a mining operation on a frontier world. The work was routine and profitable. Krell stopped mentioning the rejected Keltharian contract and even admitted privately that the captain had probably made the right decision. Then news began spreading through the mercenary networks at Corval Station. The Creever Reavers had accepted the contract against the human outpost on New Dakota. They were assembling a force of 80 mercenaries, twice the number that the Keltharians had originally suggested. The Reavers were bringing heavy weapons and armored vehicles. Several mercenaries at the station placed bets on how long the battle would last and whether the humans would surrender or fight to the death. Zixthar heard the news and felt a mixture of curiosity and concern. Part of him wanted to be proven wrong about human combat capabilities. If the Reavers succeeded with acceptable casualties, it would mean he had turned down a fortune based on exaggerated stories. But his instincts told him that the upcoming battle would only confirm everything he had learned during his research. The attack on the human outpost began on a Tuesday morning according to standard galactic time. News reached Corval Station within hours through various intelligence networks that mercenaries used to track their competition. The initial reports said the Reavers had achieved complete surprise and were pushing toward the outpost walls. Several mercenaries who had bet against the humans began celebrating early. Updates continued arriving throughout the day, and the tone changed dramatically. The Reavers had reached the outer defenses but were taking heavy casualties from prepared positions. The humans were fighting with intensity that shocked even the hardened Reaver mercenaries. Every meter of ground cost the attackers blood, and the advance slowed to a crawl. By evening, the reports indicated that the Reavers had lost over 30 mercenaries and still had not breached the main outpost walls. The human defenders were using sniper fire, improvised explosives, and coordinated counterattacks to inflict maximum damage. Several Reaver units had broken and retreated after taking 50% casualties in failed assaults. The battle continued through the night and into the next day. Zixthar followed the updates with grim fascination. The Reavers committed their reserve forces and brought up their heavy weapons. They finally breached the outer wall after 18 hours of continuous combat, but found themselves facing an even more determined defense at the inner positions. The final report came on the second day. The Creevor Reavers had withdrawn from the battle after losing 53 mercenaries killed and another 20 wounded. Their commander had decided that continuing the assault would result in complete destruction of his force, with no guarantee of success. The human outpost remained in human hands. The casualty report from the human side was almost insulting in its brevity. The defenders had suffered 6 casualties total, with 3 wounded and none killed. The human commander was identified as Sergeant Lisa Carter, and her after-action report was leaked through intelligence channels within days. She described the engagement in typical understated, human fashion as applying standard, defensive protocols against an enemy force that withdrew after sustaining significant casualties. The mercenary community at Corval Station reacted with shock and a certain amount of satisfaction at being proven right. The Creever Reavers had been one of the most feared mercenary companies in the galaxy, and they had been stopped cold by 20 human soldiers defending a minor outpost. The betting pools paid out to those who had wagered on human victory, and several mercenaries bought Zixthar drinks to congratulate him on his wisdom in refusing the contract. The most significant development came 3 days after the battle ended. The Creevor Reavers issued a public statement that spread through every mercenary hub and network. Their surviving commander announced that the company would no longer accept contracts targeting human military positions under any circumstances. The statement was blunt and honest in a way that mercenaries respected. The commander explained that humans did not fight like normal soldiers. They fought like cornered predators with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Every single human defender had fought with savage determination that seemed impossible to sustain. The Reavers had superior numbers, better equipment, and more combat experience, but none of that mattered against opponents who refused to acknowledge they were beaten. The statement concluded by saying that the payment was not worth the cost in lives, and that any mercenary company considering contracts against humans should expect massive casualties, regardless of how favorable the tactical situation appeared. The commander recommended that smart mercenaries avoid fighting humans and instead seek them as allies, where their terrifying combat effectiveness would work in your favor rather than against you. The Keltharians were forced to settle their territorial dispute through diplomatic channels after spending enormous amounts of money on 2 failed mercenary contracts. The arbitration hearing proceeded as scheduled, and the humans kept their outpost. The whole situation became a cautionary tale in mercenary circles about the importance of proper intelligence gathering and knowing when to refuse a contract. Zixthar's decision to turn down the original contract became known throughout Corval Station. Instead of mockery for refusing lucrative work, he received respect from other mercenary commanders. His reputation for good judgment and survival instincts brought better contracts from clients who valued working with mercenaries who were professional enough to refuse jobs they could not complete successfully. Krell bought his captain a drink one evening and admitted that refusing the human contract had been the right decision. The Draken warrior said he had learned an important lesson about the difference between bravery and stupidity. Sometimes the smartest choice was knowing when not to fight. Zixthar updated his personal database of contracts to avoid. Under the entry for human military targets, he wrote a simple note that would guide his future decisions. He noted that payment was irrelevant when facing opponents who inflicted unacceptable casualties. He recommended declining all such contracts and suggested that humans would make better allies than enemies. Word continued spreading through mercenary networks across the galaxy. The story of the Krivor Reaver's defeat became another tale shared in cantinas and meeting halls. Young mercenaries heard the warnings from veterans who had learned hard lessons about human combat capabilities. A new understanding emerged among professional soldiers of fortune that some targets were not worth any amount of money. The humans remained largely unaware of their growing reputation in mercenary circles. They continued performing their duties, defending their outposts and occasionally wondering why enemy forces seemed reluctant to engage them directly. The human soldiers on New Dakota received medals for their defense and were rotated back to Dakota